Okay, well, good evening. Welcome to the Remote Pacific to Gold Coast Yacht Race this year. On behalf of our board, our management, and the members, I'd like to wish you all a really great race and a good one. Enjoy it. This evening, you're going to hear from Gabriel Woodhouse on Bob. And that'll be followed by Nivala, our chairman of the race committee. And then David Kurt, who will talk about the radio requirements, and then finally, Drew Jones from Start Port Yacht Club will do that final sec. Okay, could I ask Gabriel to come on and talk about the great weather you're about to receive? Thank you.
Unfair in terms of the introduction. Hi, I'm Gabrielle Woodhouse from the Bureau.
Nothing heard. Speak up.
I'll try and speak louder. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Thank you. I'm Gabrielle Woodhouse. I'm from the Bureau of Meteorology. And I'm very unfortunate in this wind forecast for the race ahead. Hopefully today what we'll go through first is just a little bit on some of the marine safety and what you can find in the forecast, where you can find the forecast, and then we'll get into the weather part of it also. Thank you. So the first part that you see in the forecast is going to be all around the wind. With the winds, you just find that there's the direction that it's coming from as well as the knots. Now it's looking at that 10-minute mean average, so you know that wind's going to be fluctuating around a lot. And so when the forecast is saying, something like 15 to 20 knots, which isn't really on the cards at the moment, that's when you're looking at the risk of some of those winds being stronger at times. And so quite often what you want to be aware of is that those wind gusts are going to be up to about 40% stronger than what you'll see on that forecast. So one thing to bear in mind, and the second part is with those directions, if we've got thunderstorms around, particularly if you see any water spouts out on the water, you know that you're going to be having those winds turning and they can be going from any direction. So if you do see those sorts of features out of the water, be very careful, because that's when you'll see those winds being a fair bit stronger and also coming from a pretty erratic direction and not what you'd see on the general forecast. In addition to that, you'll also find on the forecast that there's the wind warning. So we do have set thresholds to reach before we'll issue particular warnings. At the moment, it's fairly unlikely that we'll see any warnings throughout this race, but just a little reminder that for the most part, we're looking at strong wind warnings. We're looking at winds of more than 26 knots. Once we get above 34 knots, we're looking at gales. And when we start to get into that storm and hurricane force, one thing to note is pretty rare that we see those sorts of winds along the New South Wales coast and even into Queensland, unless we're seeing something like a really deep east coast low or a tropical cyclone. One thing to note is storm force winds aren't thunderstorms. So whilst they do still use that word storm, they are quite different, and we're expecting thunderstorms being a risk across the forecast. They'll be mentioned separately. The next part of the forecast is generally around the waves. So looking at seas and swells. So as you know, there's a lot of different waves that have been generated out on the ocean. And so these are split into the wind wave, and that's the really short-term choppy kind of wave, as well as the more organized swell. So we do try to separate those out to give you an indication. And when we combine those two together, you know that sometimes we'll have cross aligning and peaks aligning, and sometimes cancel each other out. So it means that you'll have a range of different significant wave heights that you can see. So what you'll see on the forecast is the significant wave height, and just know that with those waves, once they combine in the right kind of pattern, you can see those wave heights being about double. So one thing to be wary of in that part of the forecast. The other part of things to be wary of on the water is obviously different weather systems that are going to have a bit of an impact. So whether it's going to be some reduced visibility, some fog or some haze, or you've got thunderstorms, or you've got east coast lows, or you've got massive wind changes, there are a few of the things to sort of keep an eye on in the forecast and be prepared for those as you go out. So looking at where to get the forecast from. So for the forecast, for the conditions within the 60 nautical miles from land, that's where we're looking at all of those winds, waves, and weather. Those forecasts go out for the next 4 days and they're issued twice a day. But if we're looking at any of those wind warnings those will be updated every 6 hours. So one thing to bear in mind is that those do get updated quite frequently. And if we do see conditions change from what was forecast and say those winds are actually a little bit stronger than what we're expecting, and maybe we thought only going to be 25 knots, but we're seeing 26, 27 or 28 knots, we will update those forecasts, issue warnings, and likewise cancel. So just looking at those coastal waters forecasts for this race, we've got everything from the Sydney enclosed waters, the Sydney, Hunter, Macquarie, Coast, Byron, and the Gold Coast waters. So this is what you typically kind of see. So this is from a couple of years ago, but the main thing is still there. We're looking at the winds, the seas, the swell, and weather. What you'll notice is that warnings aren't included in here. This has got all the details in it, and the warning is highlighted by that yellow bar at the top. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what those warning conditions actually look like. It'll be quite broad. It'll be like it's just for these particular coastal waters, and the specific detail is going to be in the main forecast. Further than 60 nautical miles offshore, that's where we have a similar forecast, but it's formatted a little bit differently, and it's more of a text-based forecast, and it covers a pretty huge area. So similar sort of thing where it's issued at least twice a day, but it looks at the next 24 hours. And when there are warnings, that's also updated every 6 hours. Here it's got a similar sort of pattern where it has the warnings at the top, tells you the situation, and then tells you the actual forecast. And if we go to the next slide and have a look at the wind warning, it's a similar thing where it starts off, what type of warning is it? Is it a gale wind warning? Is it a storm force warning? What's the situation? What area is it around? And what are the forecast conditions in it? Another place to get some information is from METI. So we have significant wave heights, swell, weather, wind, temperature. You know, there's a lot of stuff in METI, and that's often what you also see and feeds through to the Bureau's app. So one thing to note that they're all one and the same. It's just a different way of being able to look at some of that data. So when you're out on the water, there's a few ways to be able to get some information. So there's in Inmarsat satellite, you've got the HF radio, the VHF radio, and we've also got the Marine Light website, which just has all of those forecasts and warnings, but in a text format as well as some of the charts. And so we'll go to the next bit. So the bit that everyone wants, and I wish that I could deliver some more wind, but that's the way life goes sometimes. What we're looking at for the week ahead is actually pretty stable sort of weather pattern, with that ridge really maintaining itself across the northern parts of New South Wales. So that's unfortunately going to lead to pretty light wind conditions. And the fronts and troughs that we've been keeping a close eye on, they've just been weakening and impacting further south. So it's more likely we'll see some windy conditions over the southern parts of New South Wales and down through Tasmania and Victoria, but less likely along the northern parts of the New South Wales coast or into southeast Queensland. So with that, we are looking at pretty light winds throughout the race, and we'll probably see some overnight land breezes really close inshore. One thing to note is we'll have a couple of little troughs that bring some very brief and big sort of southwesterly changes, and they will kind of wash out pretty quickly. The strongest of those is probably going to be on Tuesday, and it's not even all that strong in the grand scheme of things. So looking at Saturday morning, initially we'll have that usual sort of drainage flow of sort of west-northwesterly of around 5 to 8-ish knots. But by the time we get to the middle of the afternoon, we're looking at those winds turning more northerly. And once we get into the afternoon proper and we start to head further north, we'll see those winds increase to about 10 knots. Through the Hunter Coast, you can see that we might get 10 to 15, but further north, it's really going to be 5 to 10 knots. And I mean, this is a little bit of what we're looking at for the race ahead. Unfortunately, the one thing to note with these winds is that trough that we're going to be seeing is just going to rush to the south. That may end up producing just a little bit of instability in the atmosphere. So if you are trying to head well offshore, there is a risk that we could see some thunderstorms develop. Now, it's a little bit different to what you typically see during summer, where you see storms develop on the land and then, you know, kind of over the water. In this particular case, you might see some thunderstorms well and truly over the land, like pretty much over the ranges and in the distance. And then later on, you might see something bubble up out to the eastern parts over the water. So if you are well offshore, there is the risk of some thunderstorms, and it's going to probably align more so with where the water temperatures are a little bit warmer. So one thing to note in that regard for the Saturday and a little bit later in the piece as well. So by Sunday morning, you can see that we have those winds a little bit more westerly through parts of the Hunter. It's still a bit more northwesterly, but pretty light along the Macquarie coast. So not much I can really say in terms of these winds. Inshore, you might be able to pick up a little bit of a breeze from the land breeze during the early parts of the morning, but for the most part, there's not much wind around. And again, if you're really far offshore, there's a slight chance you could see a shower or thunderstorm, but it is quite a low risk. By Sunday afternoon, again, you can see those winds becoming quite variable. For the most part, a couple of knots. If you're lucky, a few bits getting up to 5 or 10 knots, but realistically, not a huge amount of wind is around during Sunday, and also once we move into Sunday night and Monday. But what you'll start to see is those winds along the northern parts of the coast. If you're a little bit offshore, they're going to be northerly. If you're right inshore overnight on Sunday night and into Monday morning, you'll see them be a little bit more westerly, maybe a tiny bit during a little bit stronger during the early parts of Monday morning. But if we do see that, there is a risk that we'll see some fog and hazy conditions develop over the land. And so you might see some of those conditions spill out over to the water as well. So yeah, be wary of that if you're really close inshore on Sunday night and Monday morning. Now, I've put a couple of model comparison charts in today just to give you an indication as to how similar some of the global models are painting the picture across the region. And what I want to draw your attention to is the sort of shape of the fronts that are crossing Tasmania, and whether we have a low that's a little bit further north or a little bit further south. Because if we see that squeeze of those isobars a little bit further north, get a little bit more wind, which I think is what we're after. So for the moment on Monday, for the most part, we're looking at pretty light and variable winds with that reach really across the northern parts of New South Wales. So Monday morning, not much wind, a little bit of inshore land breeze, maybe some haze with that. But as we get through the afternoon and into the evening, we'll see those winds turn a little bit more southwesterly along parts of the Macquarie coast, but it washes out really quickly. So by Monday afternoon and evening, we'll see those winds turn more southeasterly. By Monday night, back northerly and pretty light. So if we now go to Tuesday, again, you can see those models pretty similar in terms of that pattern. So, and for this kind of range, they're not too bad in terms of their consistency. One thing that I will draw your attention to, though, is that depending on just where that high is sitting, you might be able to get a little bit more southeasterly if you're a little bit further up the coast by Tuesday. So in the top left-hand corner of that panel, you'll see a little bit more in the way of some that orangey yellow colour, and that's where we're looking about 10 to 15 knots. So hopefully it ends up being like that and you get a little bit of wind. But for the most part, if you're along the sort of central and mid-north coast of New South Wales, those winds are going to be pretty light and variable. And that's pretty much what we're looking at. So initially, as that first change comes through, we'll see some southwesterly winds develop along parts of the Macquarie coast, maybe getting 10, 15 knots briefly with it. But what we've been seeing out of the model run so far is that they've been decreasing some of that strength from run to run. So will I think it's still going to be like this in a couple of days' time? It might be more around 10 knots, but we'll wait and see. And once we get into Wednesday and Thursday, what we can see in these charts is a fairly significant cold front over parts of the Bight and down through the Southern Ocean. And that's going to push that high out to the Tasman Sea. So once we see that high shift further east, we'll start to get a little bit more northerly wind along the New South Wales coast. The problem is going to be exactly where that ridge is sitting for what wind strength you're going to see along the very far northern coast of New South Wales and into southeast Queensland. So at the moment, for Wednesday and Thursday, we can see those winds increasing ahead of that change come through. And once we get to Friday, we start to move into pretty uncertain territory. So this is to be honest, this is actually a pretty consistent forecast what we tend to see, more than a week out. Those models tend to be all over the shop. They will, for the most part, they have that cold front coming through and responding to that cold front. They're developing some kind of a low, whether it's somewhere over near the Bight or over the Tasman Sea. There is the risk of something, and with that, looking at a little bit more wind coming around, but for the most part, for the week ahead, you're not looking at too much wind, so I'm really sorry about that. I wish I had a magic wand to be able to give you a little bit more, but that's the way life goes. So once if you have managed to make it into the Gold Coast this afternoon, during the first half of next week, we're looking at pretty sunny conditions, and realistically throughout the race, we're looking at pretty fine conditions. There's just that really slight risk of a shower or thunderstorm well offshore. And once we move to about Wednesday, that's when we're looking at the chance of a few showers around. But at the moment, pretty light showers in the grand scheme of things, a couple of millimetres at best. So trying to piece together the currents for the coming days. And there's a few little bits in there. You can see that we've got two sort of filaments of that current. One that's really quite close to the coast along the Macquarie coast, but it starts to weaken over the course of the first half of next week, whilst the one further north up over the sort of southeast Queensland, it does increase a little bit, but then it weakens up again come the middle part of the week. And looking at the sea surface temperatures at the moment, for the most part, they're about 19 to 21, and once you get up towards Queensland, maybe even getting up to 22 degrees. So reasonably warm, but not outrageously warm. And it does mean that overnight, those minimum temperatures, if you're well offshore, probably going to hover around 18 or 19 degrees. But if you're inshore and you're picking up that land breeze, it is going to be colder. So it probably will be more like 14 or 15 degrees in terms of that air temperature overnight. Looking at tides, obviously we're on an increasing tide over the coming days until we get to the full moon. But for the most part, those really low tides are going to be in the middle part of the day, in the middle part of the night. So they're the ones that I'll be avoiding. But yeah, so in terms of summarising the race ahead, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of wind around. It is going to be quite light and variable, and going to be something to keep an eye on for those land breezes, mainly during the early hours. So I'd say for the most part, we'll see some of those develop from about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then start to weaken off from about 8 or 9 a.m. And with that could bring a little bit of hazy conditions along the coast, maybe even some patchy fog. And if you're well offshore, then that's where there's the risk of seeing some really isolated thunderstorms, but it is a low risk at this stage. So with that, I hope that it's a really good race for you guys. And that you get some lovely sightseeing involved as well.
Right, news. Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce Ngara, who is the chairman of the race committee, and he's really going to be talking this evening on the sailing instructions, and also he's going to be calling up boats that outstanding paperwork, the famous outstanding paperwork needed to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Commodore Arthur, and also acknowledge Commodore Drew from Southport Public Water. Yeah, so Lee Bard, I'm the race director and the chairman of the committee. The committee this year includes David Keller, of course, is the deputy chair, Mark Pavillard, Peter Whitford, and also Noel Cornish, and also Peter Shipway as well. Welcome to this, the compulsory briefing, as is the final weather brief at 8 a.m. This Saturday, the 29th of July, before race start. Acknowledged, of course, the Commodore, the Cruising Yacht Club, Southport Yacht Club, Noakes, of course, the sponsor, the Bureau. You're still called the Bureau, is that correct, Gabby? I know there's been yeah, definitely the bomb. So thank you. AMSA, obviously, Water Police, Marine Rescue, the media, and of course, I acknowledge most importantly the competitors, you, the elite athletes who are about to take on this race. Some of you, obviously, many times previously, some of you for the first time. So the committee, we're volunteers, we're independent, and our role is to ensure that it's a safe, a fair, before, during and after, and as fast a race as practical, as Gabby alluded to. It may not be as fast a race as you would hope, and we would hope, but that's our responsibility. We've got a broad range of backgrounds. We are not risk adverse, we are simply risk aware, and I'll just talk you through some of that shortly. Our starting point is that while fair, we are black and white in terms of expectations, and the race discipline to make sure the race is managed correctly, that those who participate do so with a very clear direction, sailing instructions, notes of the race and the rules. I'll apply discretion if I have to, but our starting point is for fairness is a black and white application. And some of you would have experienced that in terms of certification and regulatory issues before the race. But I do appreciate the spirit in which people have actually dealt with the selling office and dealt with us leading up to this race. It's been really impressive, and it's been, it all bears well as we start on Saturday. So I thank all owners and participants for their cooperation and your regulatory compliance. I just want to start off by saying the discipline of the SCAD. You know, safe, fair, fast races, it's all about good communication. And you know, you're qualified in your crews, make sure you respect the discipline of the SCAD. We have the contingency plans for the full range of emergencies, and we always assume the worst conditions. And in fact, many of you know, some of the worst incidents we've seen have been in the lightest conditions. So we cannot be complacent. And we learn obviously from precedents and adopt to the changing regulations. You must have the correct but minimum requirements for safety numbers, that is crew, at all times. And any crew changes must be advised and acknowledged to the sailing office. And just because you've offloaded crew member, doesn't mean just because you started with the right crew, you must maintain that throughout the numbers, whether it be radio operators or qualified people throughout the whole race. Please note the advice on the potential hazards to navigation. There are a number of new official reefs. One's being corrected near the finish line, which is good, at the bar. Of course, it's now much better going in Southport, as I understand it, Drew and Simon, which is great. But there was one just north of the finish line last year. So be aware of those artificial reefs. Reporting at the start, it is a large fleet, 57 entries, and the race is on, even though it's a light conditions. And the PRO, will speak to me on Saturday, and we'll make our calls at this stage. The race will start on time, 57. So it's really important that you are, as a large fleet, you approach the committee vessels on VHF 72 and apply due consideration while manoeuvring. The PRO will advise for line clear or may individually recall when advised and you'll be advised by VHF. But just to note, in this race, there is no general recall following a race start. That will be individual only. If you do decide to discontinue racing or offload crew, I just remind you, you need to inform us. Don't just do it. And as I said, we may come back to you to confirm, and I'm not trying to second guess you, to make sure that you still meet all the requirements. As said, that's not just about safety, that's also about fairness. Declarations must be made in the cases outlined in the sailing instructions and within 6 hours of finishing. And please ensure that you receive a receipt. Please note this, that boats may be subject to spot checks up to 12 hours after their finish time. And this year, there will be a measurer at the finish at Southport Yacht Club conducting random inspections to ensure compliance with rating certificates. Grading instructions, David Keller will do that. We'll come back to questions in a moment if I can. Someone's got a question on that. David Keller will follow me and detail the radio structure for this race. Please ensure you maintain a continuous listening watch on VHF channel 16. Enough said on that. Skeds will be conducted at the Marine Rescue Sydney, which is up at Terry Hills, at 0535 and at 1835 daily. And of course, your position must be accurately charted at 0530 and at 1830. And this year there is mandatory satellite phone SMS position Skeds at 1335 hours daily from this Sunday the 30th. This will be in addition to the verbal satellite communication checks. If you have a problem reporting a sked, make every effort by VHF through another vessel or call race control or myself or my mobile. Your tracker is to track you. The sked confirms that you're okay. Again, the discipline of the sked. You will not need to touch the trackers at all unless you need to activate the beacon. You must at all times keep a proper listening watch and of course visual watch on VHF channel 16. Report wind strengths and wave heights when the wind exceeds 40 knots. If you do retire, please continue to participate in the skeds and advise when you report. And this has been excellent the last couple of major races, so thank you for that. At the start, the media will be placed to racing action, as you'd expect, and this will be on a non-interference basis. And there may be some movements between some boats if requested by the media. Man overboard, good VHF, communicate well, early, external, early broadcast, deploy life-saving devices, deal with your circumstances, and we will be ready to help. Emergency steering checks. Have you done them? Do you have a deployment plan? Have you practiced this? To be frank, There was a significant number of rudder issues in the last Rolex Sydney Hobart yacht race and a range of yacht responses. So please do your checks, practice. Please check your PFDs. Inadvertent triggering of EPIRBs and PLBs. There was 3 in this race last year. Please ensure you maintain and take good care of all your personal equipment, not just the PLBs, but also your life jackets, your AA smoke mobs, any other equipment, and of course regular servicing you should have done by now, and hopefully you're ready for that. A guide to PLB care has been produced by AMSA in conjunction with manufacturers. Please ensure you read this carefully. Cool race control. If you are aware of an accidental activation, inadvertent, of a device such as a PLB or an EPIRB, and we do apply the 30-minute rule. That is AMSA, and we will speak to them. If you have not informed us, if it, and you think that it is actually inadvertent, a response, including potentially an aircraft or a helicopter, will be heading your way. And of course, we'll have to deal with that situation on many levels. Sea life, those who've been out there recently, there's lots of whales, dolphins, and sunfish. Where we normally say unlikely, it's now possible that you will actually strike, and you'll strike at night time. Note the sailing instruction on drones and comply, and there will be a drone around Port Macquarie capturing footage of the fleet, just as you would have a drone as you're around Tasman Island. Maintain a good lookout, as I said, by all means. I want to thank the sailing office led by Tara, Andrea, obviously the race committee, but in particular all of the many volunteers, and I hope you thank them as well, especially when you get to Southport and obviously around the club here. Enjoy the Gold Coast and Southport. But please remember that you do represent this race. You do represent your club. You do represent your yacht. There have been some incidents, as you'd expect, of poor behaviour. As I remind myself, nothing good becomes to do after midnight. But anyway, just I say that partly not to father you, but I just want to remind everybody of our responsibilities and who we are representing. So the race is on. It's going to be a safe race. It's going to be a fair race. Like I say, it's going to be a fast race. Clearly isn't, but we'll make it the fastest it can be. I remind you about the compulsory weather and final race admin briefing for 8 a.m. this Saturday, the 29th. We'll take questions now, and then also there's some paperwork, and also for the webinar there'll be questions, opportunities for those who are actually listening in. There are outstanding documents, paperwork from Frantic, Pateen, Mayfair, Red, URM, Secret Men's Business, and Maritime. I think that's the ones outstanding. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was absolutely fantastic. Well done. John Kirk will be up next to talk about.
We utilise an antenna system up and down the coast that they link in and link out, depending on where the fleet are. So unlike HF, where you hear everything going on, you may not hear the replies from the yachts that are not in your vicinity. So it becomes a little different. You'll hear the calls and you'll hear my reply to the calls, but you may not hear them. So don't worry if you're missing that. It's quite normal. As Lee said, we've got 2 skids a day, 0535 and 1835. We also have introduced this year the mandatory reporting on sat phone positions at 1335. This is trying to help us develop our system for reporting on sat phones so that we can gradually start to do away with the HF reporting in the longer races. We really appreciate your help with this. The system that we use endeavours to give you a reply, but we're having trouble getting it to reply to sat phones. So you may not get a reply after you've sent your position. But 60 minutes later, so 1435, we will send an email to the fleet. So that you will then have a list of of those that have been received. Appreciate your help with that, and it is helping us get better knowledge and determine our capabilities.
You might want to fix the sound in here first.
How am I going now? Okay, we've got additional reports after point danger. Oh, I should say, all the skids are on 6, so you're using 72 out of the harbour, and then all the skids will be on 6. There are additional reports after point danger on 72 to Southport finish line, not race control. You need to maintain a listening watch on VHF 16. If we have any incidents, it doesn't matter where you are, we can come back to the entire fleet on 16. As most of you are aware, we've been having a lot of PLB activations. There may not be too much water on the deck in this race, but and AMSA take a pretty dim view if we can't contact you. So keep maintaining that listening watch on VHF 16. Finally, with the weather, there could be several of you will take a pretty wide route up the coast. The VHF system works to 20-25 miles. If you're wider than that, please sat phone before the skid to race control to let them know your position. And finally, with the longer race, we'll probably start to wrap things up with the skids, with the tail enders, and we'll let you know when we're going to do that, and we'll switch to telephone calls to you. So thanks for that. Have a good race, and be chatting to you on Saturday evening.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. And next up, we've got Drew. Drew Jones is the Commodore of the Southport Yacht Club, and he's going to give you an address. Hold on.
Good evening. Can you hear me? All right.
Use this one, Andrew.
Okay, now. Hello? Hear me? No? Just yell. I'll give it my best voice. As you know, my name is Drew Jones, and I'm the proud Commodore of the Southport Yacht Club. We once again are really excited to have you guys coming to visit us. I can assure you, in the last couple of months, the seaway has been blessed. It is better than it was the last time you were there. So majority, 80%, 85% of the boats have no problems coming to the seaway at any time. I will also ensure that if you're one of the last boats, the club will still be open for you when you get there. And we've bought extra jumps. So just a couple of quick things from our point of view. We have two announcements. Star Paradise has now moved to October, the King's birthday weekend. So if any of you guys are coming back from Hamilton and all that, and you haven't run out of puff to go racing, there is a 3-day regatta down on the Gold Coast. We have many divisions, two-handed, short-handed. IRC, we've got the IRC state championships at the same time. And I think, oh, there we go. Here we go. Oh, there you go. I don't have to shout. Well, and our next big thing is that as of August next year, the first, we will, after you guys have done the Sydney to Gold Coast, we will be having a Gold Coast to Mackay race, which will consist of 520 nautical miles. The Mackay Harbour is really getting behind it. They will give you up to 2 days free time when you're there, and then they will give you a reduced price. So you'll hear more about that over the next couple of months. As I said, the food will be warm, the alcohol will be cold, and we seriously look forward to seeing you. If you have any questions, don't ask me, ask Simon.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, well, this one worked. That's a little bit better. Thank you so much, Drew. I look forward to seeing you up in Southport. Tuesday, Wednesday. Anyone who hasn't signed in yet, please would you sign in? And at the back of the room are the Marina Perth layout, so you pick up the Marina Perth layouts and find your Perth as well. Good luck, everyone, and I really hope you do get a good race through this. Yeah. Is that a question?
About 11:30.
I think we'll be there from about 11:30. Anything else? Well, thank you so much. Good luck in Southport.